The biggest sporting event in the history of Ukraine is under threat. European politicians are calling for a boycott of all Euro 2012 matches to be held there in June. They're reacting to the treatment of the former Ukrainian Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, now in prison. Should sport be used as a tool to apply political pressure? Can this kind of pressure achieve results? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. The imprisonment of the former Ukrainian Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko has led to growing calls for boycott of the Euro 2012 Football Championship. It's being co-hosted by Ukraine and Poland. Now, the threats of a boycott are in response to Tymoshenko's 7-year prison sentence, as well as to how she's been treated in jail. Last week, pictures of Tymoshenko showed what appeared to be bruises and grazes on her stomach and arm. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has said she wouldn't attend any games played in Ukraine unless the human rights situation under President Viktor Yanukovych improved. Austria and the Netherlands are also boycotting the games, and several European leaders have cancelled visits to the country. Ukraine has invested $9 billion in new stadiums and transportation facilities for the games. Its government is accusing Berlin of reviving what's been called the methods of the Cold War. And the people who are directly affected by this, the Ukrainians themselves, this is what some of them had to say.
We think that it's natural and our authorities dig their own graves. I, for example, always read a newspaper in English weekly. It constantly writes about the high hotel tariffs, how everything's going to be bad for the euro. At the same time, if foreigners are reading it, then it's not even about Tymoshenko. It's that our country is not quite ready for the championship.
The countries of the European Union and its leaders should solve their own problems, and that they are very often ruled by double moral standards. Get your own houses in order and then look at Ukraine, and then maybe we will follow your advice.
Boycott? This is not a football thing. Football is football, and it should, as they say in Ukraine, be held under all conditions and under all weather conditions even.
I heard that the European countries want to refuse to attend things that are going to happen in Ukraine, Euro 2012. That Ukraine could not take part in the Olympics, all other sports. Similarly, in the Euro and in the Olympics. I think it's right, because if our country can't ensure our rights and responsibilities, to ensure that we have social security so that we're not considered.
So should sport be used as a tool to apply political pressure? To answer this question, we're joined by guests, all in London. Keir Radnedge, veteran football journalist. Mehrdad Masoudi, a former FIFA press officer during the France 1998 World Cup. And David Mepham, the UK director of Human Rights Watch. Welcome, gentlemen. Mr. Radnedge, what do you think of this boycott? Is it going to be a waste of time if it goes ahead?
Well, I think from the politicians' point of view, if they want to make a point, then they can make a point. I think that, there are different sorts of boycotts. There are boycotts where just politicians stay away from ceremonial occasions. There are boycotts, more pernicious ones, where politicians involve these sportsmen and women in their boycotts. They're sort of different kind of events. At the end of the day, the football championship will go ahead whether Angela Merkel goes there or not.
But if a leader is not going to attend the event, isn't it putting some kind of pressure on the sportsmen and women anyway?
No, I don't think it puts any pressure on them at all. If you're a sportsman, if you're a footballer going to the European Championship, you are focused laser-like on the preparation, the matches, your training. You don't even think about who's going to be there, apart from maybe your wife, partner, girlfriend, or whatever. Whether your president, prime minister is there or not, it really doesn't cross your radar.
So do you think this would be more effective at home, possibly, if, for example, Angela Merkel doesn't go? And of course, she isn't.
Well, I think where it makes a point really is if Angela Merkel doesn't go to the matches in Ukraine, it's making a political point on behalf of the German government towards the Ukrainian president and the people there. And that's really quite a narrow political debate.
Mr. Mepham, do you support that political point being made by those leaders?
I have a lot of sympathy with the comments that have been made. I think the crucial thing to remember about Ukraine is there is a serious human rights situation here, and the treatment of Yulia Tymoshenko, for example, needs to be very thoroughly investigated. It appears that she's been badly beaten. That needs to be independently investigated and so on. I mean, as an institution, Human Rights Watch generally tends not to call for cultural and sporting boycotts because, in a way, we think it's a second-order question. I think the primary task that we have as an independent human rights organisation is to draw attention to human rights abuses that are taking place in countries like Ukraine or in Bahrain, and to press the governments of those countries to curb those abuses. Now, governments have a critical role to play, both the governments themselves that are responsible for those abuses, but also governments around the world that have influence with them. And that's where we tend to focus our energies and our effort in getting them to be more assertive with those countries to correct those human rights abuses.
Tymoshenko seems to agree with you. She's saying that there shouldn't be a boycott, that it's far more effective to let the games go ahead. Do you agree with that?
Well, what I think, if I could come in, what I think we do, and we do this unashamedly, we will do this in the case of Ukraine. We're doing it actually in the case of Azerbaijan, which is hosting a big song contest, the Eurovision Song Contest, in a couple of weeks' time. We did it in relation to Bahrain with Formula One, is to use the media profile and the media spotlight that is thrown on these countries for a period of time to really highlight and expose the serious human rights abuses that are taking place in those countries. That's essential, and it's a very important way in which we can get pressure brought to bear to get those governments to improve their act.
Mr. Masoudi, what is FIFA's stance on all this?
In principle, basically everyone believes that sports and politics should not mix. But it would be naive to think that they would not. Going back to the 1960s, when South Africa was basically banned from participating in CAF competitions, the African competitions, Sir Stanley Ross, the then president of FIFA, famously was quoted as saying that we are not interested in the domestic issues of South Africa, and FIFA should not be embroiled into what happens within South African political scene. We are a sports organization, and we know what happened. A year later, South Africa basically was banned. He brought South Africa back to the fold, and by 1976, South Africa was expelled from FIFA. In fact, that stance, Sir Stanley Ross's stance, cost him his presidency in 1974, because Havelange came in with the backing of the majority of African countries and third world countries who were against the apartheid regime in South Africa. And that was a clear example of how politics and sports, football, mixed. There are far too many examples in football. In 1973, the Soviet Union boycotted playing in the national stadium in Chile, because that stadium, after the September 11, 1973 coup d'etat, was used to imprison national figures, was used as torture chamber, and the Soviet Union asked FIFA to change the venue of the event, of the game, in order, because they considered that stadium not fit and proper for a sporting event because of what had happened there in 1973. FIFA refused, and the Soviet Union boycotted the game, and Chile went on to qualify for the 1974 World Cup.
So clearly quite an effective tool. Let's pick up on what Mr. Masoudi said and talk about boycotting sports events for political gain, and that it certainly isn't a new event. It wasn't that long ago that it was common practice. A large-scale boycott took place in South Africa, as Mr. Masoudi mentioned, during the peak of apartheid during the 1970s. The country had been prevented from taking part in a number of international sporting events. In 1968, the United Nations General Assembly boycotted all of South Africa's sports bodies that practiced apartheid. In 1980, 62 countries, including the United States, West Germany and Japan, refused to attend the Moscow Olympics in protest over the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. 4 years later, in 1984, Russia and its communist East European allies retaliated by boycotting the Los Angeles Summer Olympics. Mr. Radnedge, I mean, it's hard to ever forget that incredible image of Nelson Mandela sporting the Springbok rugby jersey in 1995, and the political statement that made.
Yes, I agree with you. I think in a funny sort of way, actually, the South African situation was almost the exception that proves the other rule. I mean, for example, I think the tit-for-tat Olympic boycotts of Moscow and Los Angeles really achieved nothing. Apart from barring the athletes themselves of the countries the opportunity to express themselves. Crowds cheered, records were set, achievements were set, and if you look in the history books, you know, the gold medals are listed there. What I do think is that South Africa and the sustained international campaign certainly was a factor in helping to hasten the end of apartheid. But I actually think that South Africa was an exception to the normal rule that basically involving sportsmen and women in a boycott of an event actually tends to backfire and create a bit of a public backlash.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Mepham?
Well, actually, where I disagree with what I think the last speaker has just said slightly earlier in the discussion was I don't think it's realistic to say that you can wholly separate sport and politics. I think inevitably, as the second contributor said, these things are linked and they are involved one with another, and I think it's probably naive to think that they can be wholly separated. I think what we need to recognise is, as you've just told us by running through that recent history, this is not a wholly new issue. People have been discussing this and participating in it to some extent for many years. It's an issue we've been with for some time. The critical question is to be consistent in pressing human rights concerns where human rights are being egregiously abused, as they are in many places around the world. And I think the primary role there is for governments to use the influence they have at a very serious level, at a high level, with the offending governments. And I would like to see our government in the UK, but other governments around the world, doing much more to press Ukraine and press Bahrain and press Saudi Arabia on their human rights performance than they often appear willing to do.
Okay, let's talk about
Saudi Arabia,
Bahrain.
If I can just elaborate, is an
most
interesting one because, of course, we have the London Olympics coming up very soon.
Let's talk about Bahrain. That's the most recent event that took place. Of course, the Formula One Grand Prix happened there. Who do you think claims political victory for that?
I think the Bahrain thing was actually probably ultimately very embarrassing for Formula One, that you had Bernie Ecclestone saying that this was nothing to do with politics, but obviously it was very political. And the senior figures in the Bahraini royal family have a big financial stake in Formula One, so that whole issue came to the fore as well. But what it did allow organisations like Human Rights Watch to do, and many others, including very courageous human rights activists within Bahrain, is to use the media spotlight on that country for the period of a couple of days running up to the Formula One to draw attention to ongoing, very serious human rights abuses that are taking place in that country, and the unwillingness up to now of the Bahraini government and the Bahraini authorities to really take steps to curb those abuses. We've got very large numbers of people in Bahrain who've been imprisoned unfairly. You've got this guy on a hunger strike. You know, these are the issues that really ought to be uppermost in our minds, and pressure ought to be brought to bear to address that.
And of course the King is talking about constitutional reforms now. You wonder if that's linked to this event or not. Mr. Radnedge, does the financial rewards of sport tend to push the atrocities that could be committed in the country out of the way?
No, I don't really think that's the case. I think, in fact, you could say it works another way. I mean, I don't think you can ever separate politics and sports. It's naive to think that. Politics is involved in everything, particularly in sports at high level. You could almost say that actually a sports tournament is not of great significance unless someone somewhere is threatening to use it with a boycott. It's almost a rite of passage for a sports event. I think also that the fact that sports events go ahead, as Thomas Bach, the IOC Vice President, said this week, it does put a country where there are human rights issues into the international spotlight and gives people the opportunity to debate them, yes, argue, dispute them. And I think in a sense, that's the value that politicians' human rights concerns can make over events and sports events. That, you know, they can use them in that sort of way, as was done, as the speaker just said, in Bahrain.
So you're saying that sport and politics cannot on any level be separated. And let me just put this to Mr. Masoudi. Russia's Putin has just said that you shouldn't mix sport and politics. What do you read into that? Why would he be saying that? Why would he be going against what's been said in the studio right now?
I think he's looking forward, he's looking ahead to the 2018 FIFA World Cup that's going to be hosted in Russia. There are many issues in Russia, Chechnya being one. Racism in Russian football is quite rampant, that they are trying to tackle. So looking ahead to 2018, because 2012 in Ukraine, just next door, is probably a good barometer for what may happen in 6 years down the road in neighboring Russia. There are human rights issues in Russia.
Excuse me jumping in, is FIFA a good barometer to what's going on in countries? What drives those decisions? What drives FIFA's decisions?
FIFA's decision in principle to award the hosting rights of the 2018 World Cup to Russia was to go to a new, as it was announced, to new territories. FIFA wants to expand football beyond the borders that have, beyond the countries like Germany, England, France, and Italy, and the Eastern Bloc headed by Russia that never hosted a World Cup tournament. So that was the, at least that's what officially was announced at the time of, and Qatar was another example, going to the Middle East for the first time. Middle East is a territory that people are fanatic about football, and they've never hosted a World Cup. Qatar being the first one for 2022.
Mr. Mepham, does it excite you that these events will be taking place in Russia and Qatar, both mentioned there by Mr. Masoudi, considering the human rights abuses in both those countries?
Well, what I would hope in respect of both those countries is that we use the opportunity, that the spotlight that we placed on those countries to draw attention to their human rights situation. There's another point to our discussion which I think we haven't touched on, which is very relevant, which is it relates specifically to the Olympics. It's less about FIFA and Formula One, but the Olympics, of course, has an Olympic charter that talks about equal opportunities and talks about the opportunity for people to participate in sport. And one of the other issues that we focused a lot on is the fact that Saudi Arabia, for example, is on the International Olympic Association. It doesn't allow women and girls to participate in sport. So I think in that particular case, it is reasonable, with the London Olympics happening here in a few months' time, to be pressing the Saudis to say, you've signed up to the Olympic Charter, why are you not allowing women to participate in sport? I think that's a way in which a sporting body can legitimately use influence to press for reasonable change and to actually allow women and girls in Saudi Arabia to have opportunities that are available to men but not to women.
But of course, if sport is taking place in any of those countries, doesn't it open up these countries to other events, other influences that might benefit the country, might benefit both men and women in those countries?
That's potentially the case, but as I say, in the instance of Saudi Arabia in the forthcoming London Olympics, that's not going to happen because the Saudis up to this point have said, or certainly have not indicated sufficiently, they're going to actually allow Saudi women to participate in their sporting team, which is a violation of the Olympic Charter. And when that happened in the case of Afghanistan a few years ago, the Afghans weren't actually allowed to send an Olympic team because they were denying that opportunity to Afghan women. And there seems to be some inconsistency because that's precisely what Saudi Arabia seems willing to do.
Mr. Masoudi?
Sports, as much as it can divide, it can unite. Prime example was Iran's qualification for France '98. If the Americans remember where they were when JFK was assassinated, all Iranians all over the world remember where they were when, on that November the 29th, 1997, Iran qualified in Sydney for the World Cup. It brought a sense of nationalism that had been suppressed for 19 years to the fore again. The authorities were not able to handle the millions of fans, jubilant fans on the streets of Tehran. As a result, women's football flourished in Iran. Women made their way onto the stadium when the team landed on with a helicopter after coming back from Australia. And the game against the US, Iran-USA, magnified that sense of national jubilation. For the first time ever, people around the world were talking about a nation and its history rather than problems that its politicians had created for 2 decades.
Mr. Radnedge, Ukraine is accusing Berlin of resorting to Cold War tactics. Did those tactics achieve anything in those days in the world of sport and politics?
No, I don't think it does. I think there is obviously, the political narrative is different to the sporting narrative. And obviously you can't separate sport and politics, as we've said, and therefore they get intertwined. So I don't think you can say there's any particular positive or minus. What I would say, when we were talking, for example, about the Olympic Games and the IOC, because the Olympics have this particular charter and they have these ideals that they're always quoting, the Olympic Games does set itself up really for critics of different ideologies, countries, really to sort of almost go for the Olympics and say, well, you know, this is a particular stage on which to play our points, a little more perhaps than in other sports, particularly in terms of football, as we're talking about here.
And I guess the question is if Ukraine will change its position regardless of what happens. No, I don't think that obviously Ukraine will. I think it's part of an ongoing game, if you like, really, between Ukraine's critics and the Ukrainian presidency, and it's a piece in the jigsaw of political negotiation. Masoudi, if teams do feel pressurized to pull out and they do indeed pull out, how will FIFA view them? What are the laws governing that?
They would be barred from international competition, no doubt. I do not think the likes of Germany would withdraw from a competition on the back of pressure from their government. This threat of boycott by politicians or teams is the reason we are having this conversation here. We are having this conversation about the human rights issue in Ukraine. I think Angela Merkel has already achieved what she wanted to achieve. There is no need for Germany to withdraw. There is no need for France to withdraw or any other European country by participating.
And is that a political decision? Because I should imagine that it would be an incredible waste of the amount of money spent in the build-up to this.
A political decision? Sorry, I didn't quite catch that question.
Could this also be a financial decision? Because I should imagine it costs an awful amount of money to prepare for something like this.
No, it won't be a financial decision. As I said, I don't think Angela Merkel, when she made that statement, had this in mind that Germany would not go to the Ukraine to play in the European Championship. There might be some pressure on the German national team because as a result, their national anthem may be booed, as was the Japanese national anthem during the 2004 Asian Cup in China. Because of the history between Japan and China, every time Japan played, the whole stadium was booing the national anthem. But at the end, Japan won the cup.
And all the while, Mr. Mepham, Tymoshenko remains in jail.
She does. I mean, I agree with the last speaker that I think it's a very positive thing that we're actually having a conversation like this, in part about the human rights situation in Ukraine, which is a country that probably a lot of British citizens are not particularly familiar with. There's a very serious human rights crisis there, and it's right that we're talking about it. And in a curious kind of way, the fact that Angela Merkel has said what she's said and the fact that there's been this discussion around the football event has drawn attention to a human rights crisis there that is deserving of more serious attention. So I think there's a kind of middle position between saying let's always boycott and let's not engage, and let's a position that says let's turn a blind eye to abuses. And what Human Rights Watch is trying to do is to exploit every opportunity to bring public pressure to bear and to expose abuse and to press those governments to improve their human rights performance, because that actually is more important than anything else. It's more important than sport, much that many people around the world love and enjoy sport. Actually allowing people to fulfill and uphold their basic rights is critically important.
And very briefly, Mr. Radnedge, it's quite incredible, isn't it, that a big globe can be set in motion by a tiny globe?
Yes, I think it's very encouraging, to be quite honest, because boycotts, threats of boycotts, they're usually and almost always about the issue of freedom. And you know, that, as the last speaker said, is something that really should be of paramount importance to all of us.
Let's hope this stirs positive response. Thanks to our guests, all in London, Keir Radnedge, Mehrdad Masoudi and David Mepham. And of course, to the viewer, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. As always, if you want to send us your feedback, just email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching and goodbye.